In early summer 2025, President Donald Trump stunned the world by announcing a doubling of tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, raising them to a staggering 50%. The administration claimed national security, but Canadians saw it as a direct attack on a trusted ally. The news sent shockwaves through Canadian markets, threatening the backbone of the nation's manufacturing sector. Industry leaders warned that such tariffs could price Canadian metals out of the U.S. market, their primary export destination. Economists predicted billions in losses and severe disruptions to cross-border supply chains. The move was condemned across Canada as protectionist and punitive, raising doubts about the future of North American trade. Small businesses and entire communities reliant on steel and aluminum braced for impact. The scale of the tariff increase forced companies to urgently reassess their strategies and investments. Uncertainty gripped the nation as businesses scrambled to understand the fallout. The shock was immediate and profound, with many fearing for their livelihoods. All eyes turned to Ottawa, awaiting a response from Prime Minister Mark Carney's government. The stage was set for a major confrontation between Canada and its largest trading partner. The question: how would Canada fight back against this economic bombshell? Prime Minister Mark Carney wasted no time condemning the U.S. tariffs as illegal and unjustified. He insisted Canada would not rush into retaliation, emphasizing a need for careful strategy over knee-jerk reactions. Despite mounting pressure from businesses and provincial leaders for immediate action, Carney called for patience. He pointed to ongoing trade talks with the U.S. as a reason for restraint, hoping for a diplomatic solution. Carney reminded Canadians that counter-tariffs from previous disputes remained in place, signaling Canada still had leverage. The government launched consultations with industry leaders and international partners to weigh all options. Carney promised any response would be firm and resolute, but also measured to avoid escalation. The message: Canada would defend its interests, but not at the cost of a trade war. Anxiety remained high, but Carney's approach aimed to calm markets and buy time for a strategic response. Canadians waited, hoping for a solution that would protect jobs and restore stability. The government's next move would define the nation's economic future. Canadian steel and aluminum producers sounded the alarm, calling the tariffs an existential threat. Many companies, dependent on U.S. exports, feared being shut out of their main market. Industry leaders warned of plant closures, massive revenue losses, and thousands of jobs at risk. Ontario, home to nearly half of Canada's steel production, faced the gravest danger. Premier Doug Ford and local officials described the situation as a crisis for entire communities. Labor unions estimated thousands could lose stable, well-paying jobs, devastating families and towns. The anxiety was palpable in industrial cities from Hamilton to Sorel Tracy. Calls for federal intervention grew louder, demanding protection for workers and businesses. The human cost loomed large, with ripple effects threatening local economies and public services. The stakes were clear. Without action, Canada's industrial heartland could be gutted. The nation braced for a fight to save its manufacturing backbone. A united front emerged across Canada, demanding swift federal action. Ontario Premier Doug Ford led the charge, urging Prime Minister Carney to match U.S. tariffs and protect Canadian industry. Opposition parties slammed the government for moving too slowly, warning that delay would embolden the U.S. labor leaders, and unions called for immediate retaliatory tariffs and support for affected workers. They argued that only a strong response could defend Canadian jobs and industries from unfair competition. Proposals included urgent aid for displaced workers and a robust social safety net. Public sentiment, fueled by intense media coverage, demanded leadership and resolve. Editorials and commentators insisted Canada must stand firm against American protectionism. The pressure on Ottawa was immense, with expectations for a decisive response growing by the day. The sense of national unity was clear. Canada would not back down. All eyes were on Carney's government to deliver a plan that matched the gravity of the crisis. The country waited for action. Prime Minister Carney's government acknowledged the crisis, promising a strategic and measured response. Cabinet officials consulted with industry, economists, and provincial leaders to craft a coordinated plan. The goal: protect Canadian interests without triggering a destructive trade war. Ottawa's approach was deliberate, gathering input from all sides to avoid rash decisions. Critics, however, grew impatient, arguing that delay risked permanent damage to Canadian businesses. Opposition parties and industry leaders demanded clarity and swift action. Carney balanced calls for toughness with the need to avoid escalation. He assured Canadians that the response would be firm, but not reckless. The government's message: Canada would stand up for itself, but with precision and purpose. The stakes were enormous. Jobs, investment, and the nation's economic future hung in the balance. The challenge was to act decisively without making things worse. Ottawa's next move would shape the outcome of the trade conflict. The world watched as Canada prepared its answer. The shockwaves from Trump's tariffs rippled far beyond steel and aluminum. Canadian manufacturers in automotive, aerospace, and construction braced for higher costs and supply chain chaos. Economists warned of slower growth, lost investment, and rising consumer prices if the dispute dragged on. The uncertainty itself threatened to undermine business confidence nationwide. The tariffs also strained the deep Canada-US relationship, built on decades of trust and cooperation. Many saw the move as a political provocation, complicating both economic and diplomatic ties. American manufacturers too voiced concern, fearing higher costs and supply shortages from losing Canadian metals. The integrated North American supply chain was at risk, with consequences for jobs on both sides of the border. The dispute exposed the fragility of cross-border trade and the dangers of protectionism. Leaders in Ottawa and Washington faced mounting pressure to find a solution. The stakes were no longer just economic, they were about the future of the entire bilateral relationship. The need for resolution had never been more urgent. U.S. industry's warnings underscored the deep ties binding North America's economy. Tariffs threatened to disrupt vital supply chains, raising costs for both Canadian and American businesses. High-level trade talks continued, with Carney citing negotiations as a reason for Canada's restraint. Both sides expressed hope for a diplomatic breakthrough to end the standoff. The challenge balancing domestic pressures with the risks of escalation. For Carney, the task was to defend Canadian jobs without sparking a trade war. The stakes were high. Any misstep could damage prosperity on both sides of the border. The crisis highlighted the need for dialogue, respect, and adherence to trade norms. Despite the tension, the shared history between Canada and the U.S. offered hope for reconciliation. The coming weeks would determine if the tariff gamble would backfire, and if leaders could steer their nations back to stability. Canadians watched, hoping for a peaceful resolution and a return to strong, predictable trade. The future of North American cooperation hung in the balance.